The Compact of Vethon was signed in a language that no longer existed, by representatives of governments that no longer governed, on a station that had been decommissioned 40 years before communications officer Tessia von Raschel was born. She knew this because she had read it, not the summary appended to the hegemony's diplomatic handbook, which described the compact in 11 bloodless paragraphs and concluded with a recommendation that officers familiarize themselves with its broad provisions. She had read the actual document, 419 articles, 11 annexes, a signatory's page bearing the marks of 31 species, including one whose glyph stamp had been applied by a diplomatic attaché who, according to the footnote in Annex C, had needed to borrow a pen from the Terran delegation because the attaché's own stylus had run dry during the ceremony. Earth had signed the Compact of Vethon with its own pen and then loaned a second one to a stranger. That detail had stayed with Tessia for 6 years. She was a communications officer aboard the hegemony warship Pale Resolve, a Ketharin-class cruiser assigned to the 3rd Boundary Patrol, and she had read the compact because her commanding officer, Fleet Commander Soreth Vinalar, believed that every officer under his command should understand the legal architecture that held the boundary together. Soreth was old-school hegemony military formal, meticulous, the kind of commander who scheduled training drills on rest days and expected his crew to file after-action reports on the drills. He had served for 38 years. He had never fired the ship's primary weapons in anger. None of this mattered anymore. What mattered was that the Pale Resolve was burning. The attack had come at 06:14 local time, out of a shipping lane that the hegemony's intelligence bureau had flagged as low risk exactly 11 days prior. 3 vessels, unregistered, broadcasting no transponder codes, running with weapons hot and drives overcharged. They had dropped out of subspace inside the patrol perimeter, which should have been impossible given the sensor network the 3rd Boundary Patrol maintained along the corridor, and opened fire on the Pale Resolve before the bridge watch officer had finished saying the word contact. The first volley had gutted the forward sensor array and killed 6 crew members in the communications annex where Tessia would have been sitting if she had not stepped out 40 seconds earlier to replace a faulty data coupler in the secondary relay room. The blast had thrown her into the bulkhead. She had tasted blood. She had gotten up. The second volley had breached the port hull and taken the main drive offline. The third had destroyed the primary weapons battery. By the time Tessia reached the bridge, crawling through a corridor with emergency lighting flickering like a dying pulse, the Pale Resolve was drifting. Her shields collapsed, her port side venting atmosphere through 3 separate hull breaches, and her crew was dying. Soreth was still in the command chair. His left arm was burned from wrist to shoulder where a console had exploded beside him. He was issuing orders with the calm of a man who had decided that if the ship died, it would die with proper procedure, and proper procedure meant fighting until the last system went dark. "Communication status," he said when he saw Tessia. "Primary array is destroyed. Secondary is operational but degraded. I estimate 60% output, and the subspace carrier is unstable. I can transmit, but range is limited. Transmit a distress call. Hegemony Priority 1. Address it to Boundary Command at Station Karev 4. Tessia sat at the only functioning communications console on the bridge, a secondary station bolted to the rear bulkhead that nobody used during normal operations because it was uncomfortable and its display was too small, and began composing the distress call. She was fast. She had been a communications officer for 6 years, and she had drilled distress protocols so many times that her hands could type the codes while her mind processed the tactical situation, which was this: 3 unidentified attackers, now holding position around the drifting Pale Resolve like predators around wounded prey, were not firing. They had stopped. They were waiting. She knew why. She had recognized the attack pattern from the intelligence briefings she read on her own time, because Tessia von Raschel was the kind of officer who read things that were not assigned. The pattern matched the Seraphine Pact, a loose confederation of raider clans that operated on the far side of the boundary, taking ships for cargo, hostages, or both. The Seraphine did not destroy military vessels. They boarded them. They took the crew alive, because live crew members had trade value in the markets that operated in the interstitial spaces between hegemony territory and the unclaimed sectors. The intelligence reports described their operational doctrine in clinical detail. Disable propulsion first, weapons second, communications third. Isolate the vessel. Wait for the crew to understand their situation. Then board methodically through the same breaches the weapons had opened, because the Seraphine believed in using the wounds they inflicted as doors. The Pale Resolve had 214 souls aboard. The Seraphine boarding parties, based on the intelligence reports, would be assembling now. Signal away, Tessia reported. Hegemony Priority 1 distress, addressed to Boundary Command Karev 4. Estimated propagation time at current output, 19 minutes to the station. Assuming immediate dispatch, the nearest hegemony patrol group is 4 hours out. Sarth absorbed this. His burned arm hung at his side, and the skin had blistered from his knuckles to his elbow in a pattern that Tessia did not want to look at because it made the professional distance she was maintaining harder to hold. 4 hours. Yes, Commander. The Seraphine will board within 20 minutes. We do not have 4 hours. No, Commander. He closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, the decision was already made. All hands, this is the commander. Prepare to repel boarders. Seal all internal bulkheads. Issue sidearms to every crew member capable of holding one. Medical staff will remain in the infirmary and seal the compartment. Non-combat personnel will shelter in the aft cargo bay. Security teams to all boarding point corridors. We will hold. The bridge crew moved. They were afraid Tessia could see it in the way the helmsman's hands shook as he sealed the forward bulkhead controls, in the way the sensor operator checked her sidearm 3 times before holstering it, in the way the junior tactical officer's breathing had gone shallow and fast, but they moved. They were hegemony military. They had trained for this. Not specifically for boarding repulsion aboard a crippled cruiser against a numerically superior force, with heavy armor and 3 centuries of experience at precisely this kind of work, but for the principle that training existed to be applied, and the principle did not negotiate with circumstances. Tessia turned back to her console. She had sent the distress call to Boundary Command, but the signal was weak, the subspace carrier was unstable, and 4 hours was a death sentence. She needed to send more. She needed to send wider. Her console displayed the standard hegemony distress frequency allocations, priority 1 through 5, each addressed to a specific tier of hegemony military or civilian authority. But the console also displayed, in a small submenu that most communications officers never opened because it was labeled INTERSPECIS protocols, in text so small it was nearly illegible. A list of interspecies emergency frequencies maintained under the various compacts, treaties, and mutual assistance agreements the hegemony had signed over the past century. Most of them were inactive. The hegemony did not call for outside help. It was a point of institutional pride that the hegemony's military handled its own emergencies, resolved its own crises, and cleaned up its own messes. The interspecies frequencies existed because the treaties required them to exist, not because anyone expected them to be used. Tessia opened the submenu. The list was short, 15 frequencies, each tagged with the name of the governing treaty, the signatory species, and the activation conditions. Most required authorization from Boundary Command before transmission, a deliberate bottleneck to ensure that no field officer could unilaterally invoke an interspecies military response. But 3 frequencies were flagged differently. They were tagged as auto-invoke ON condition, which meant that the treaty's activation clause specified automatic engagement upon receipt of a properly formatted distress signal. No authorization required. No command approval. The treaty itself was the authorization. Tessia read the 3 entries. The first was the Vendarathi Mutual Defense Protocol, which auto-invoked for threats classified as extinction level. The Sarathine raiders did not meet that threshold. The second was the Rishkari Protectorate Emergency Compact, which auto-invoked for navigational hazards in shared corridors. This was a combat situation, not a navigational hazard. The third was the Compact of Vethon, Article 91. She read the activation conditions. Auto-invoke. Any signatory vessel transmitting a Priority 1 distress signal indicating hostile boarding action against military or civilian personnel. No authorization required. All signatory forces within effective response range are bound to respond with available assets. The Compact of Vethon. The document she had read 6 years ago because her commander told her to know the legal architecture. 419 articles, 11 annexes, 31 signatories, and Earth had signed it. Earth had signed it with its own pen and loaned a spare to a stranger. Tessia's hands stopped on the console. She looked at the frequency allocation for the Compact of Vethon. It was not a hegemony frequency. It was a shared interspecies band, maintained jointly by all signatories, and it broadcast on a subspace carrier that was designed for maximum range rather than maximum security. Her degraded secondary array could reach it. The propagation characteristics were different from the hegemony's internal frequencies, broader, less focused, designed to be heard by anyone listening on the band. She did not know who was listening. She did not know if anyone was within range. She did not know if the Compact of Vethon was still monitored by any signatory force, because the compact was 43 years old, and the hegemony's diplomatic service had not issued an operational status report on it since before Tessia had been commissioned. But Article 91 said auto-invoke. The treaty was the authorization. "Commander," she said, "I am transmitting a secondary distress signal on the Compact of Vethon interspecies frequency, Article 91, hostile boarding action. Auto-invoke, no authorization required." Sorath looked at her. His face did not change. "The Compact of Vethon." "Yes, Commander." "I was not aware. We still monitored that frequency." "We are required to, under the Compact's terms. Whether anyone else does is a separate question." He looked at the tactical display, where the 3 Sarathine vessels were maneuvering into boarding position around the Pale Resolve. His burned arm was trembling. He said, "Send it." Tessia sent it. The signal went out on the interspecies band, formatted to the Compact of Vethon specifications, a Priority 1 distress with the Article 91 boarding action flag, the Pale Resolve's position, hull status, crew count, and threat assessment. It went out broad and wide and unfocused, like a shout into a dark room, aimed at no one in particular because the Compact did not specify a recipient. The Compact said all signatories within range. The Compact did not say which signatories were supposed to be in range. It did not even say what effective response range meant in operational terms, whether it was 10 light minutes or 10 light years. The drafters of Article 91, writing in a dead language on a decommissioned station, had left the definition open, as if they had trusted that whoever heard the signal would decide for themselves whether they were close enough to matter. The signal departed the Pale Resolve's degraded antenna at the speed of subspace propagation and began its expansion into the void, carrying with it 214 names that Tessia could not list, but could feel the weight of every person breathing on this ship, depending on a frequency that had been silent for 43 years and might remain silent forever. Then the Seraphine boarded. They came through the port hull breaches the same wounds their weapons had opened. 3 teams. Tessia could track them on the internal sensor grid, which was still partially operational. Each team was 8 to 10 individuals, armored, moving in coordinated patterns through the corridors. They were professionals. The Seraphine had been boarding ships for 3 centuries. They knew how to move through a wounded vessel, knew which corridors to clear first, which junctions to hold, which systems to disable before pushing deeper. They moved in pairs, one covering while the other advanced, their weapons sweeping arcs that covered every blind corner and recessed hatchway. The first exchange happened on Deck 4. Security Chief Devrin von Tesseth and his 6-person team met the lead boarding party at the junction of the port corridor and the central spine. The sound of weapons fire reached the bridge through the internal comm as a staccato crackling, punctuated by shouts in Ketharin, and a language Tessia did not recognize. "Contact Deck 4 port junction," Devrin reported, his voice tight. 8 hostiles, heavy armor, suppressive weapons, we are holding. "Casualties?" Soreth asked. 2 wounded, none dead. Holding the junction. Their point man is down, but they're regrouping. I can hear a second element flanking through the maintenance shaft. The second boarding party breached on Deck 6, near the engineering section. Engineering Chief Pollex's voice came through the comm, controlled, precise. Each word measured the way engineers measured tolerances. "They've entered through the port hull breach at frame 62. I've sealed the engine room. My damage control team is holding the corridor between frames 60 and 65 with emergency barricade sections and 2 sidearms. We can hold for maybe 10 minutes. The third team was cutting through the dorsal airlock on Deck 2, directly above the bridge. The cutting tool's whine penetrated the deck plating, a persistent, tooth-vibrating hum that grew louder as the tool bit deeper. Tessia listened to the reports come in and felt something she did not have a name for, a feeling that was not fear and not anger but something between them, like watching a fire consume a house while people were still inside and knowing that you had already called for help and the help was not coming fast enough. The distress call to Boundary Command was 19 minutes old. The compact of Vethon signal had been in flight for 4 minutes. Even if someone heard it, even if someone responded, the speed of subspace propagation meant that the earliest possible response was still far beyond the time the Seraphine would need to take the ship. Soreth was commanding the defense from the bridge with his burned arm pressed against his side, and his voice never rising above the flat, measured tone of a man filing a quarterly report. He was directing security teams to fall back, consolidate, protect the non-combatant shelters. He directed the damage control party on Deck 5 to vent the port maintenance corridor to vacuum, sealing it from both ends and blowing the emergency atmospheric release, turning the corridor itself into a barrier that the Seraphine would have to cross in EVA suits or breach around. It bought the non-combat shelter on Deck 5's starboard side an additional 7 minutes. He was making the calculus that every commander made when the ship was lost, and the only remaining variable was how many of the crew survived. Delay, channel, hold. 214 people. The Seraphine would take them all if they could. The intelligence report said the raider clans sorted captives by function: officers for ransom, technicians for forced labor, everyone else for the trade markets. The officers would be isolated, questioned, assessed for ransom value. The technicians would be inventoried and shipped to repair yards in the unclaimed sectors where stolen ships were stripped and rebuilt. Everyone else, the cooks, the clerks, the maintenance ratings, the junior personnel who had signed up for a career in hegemony service and found themselves on a crippled cruiser at the wrong end of a raider corridor, would be sold. Tessia had read those reports. She had read them because she read everything, because knowledge was the only tool that did not break when everything else did. Deck 6 has fallen, Engineering Chief Pollex reported. They have the engine room. My people are barricaded in the auxiliary control space. 6 of us. They have not breached yet, but they are applying a cutting tool to the hatch. I estimate 4 minutes. Deck 4 falling back to frame 40, Devrin reported. 3 wounded, 1 critical. Ensign Treves took a shot to the torso, armor stopped penetration, but she's down with blunt force trauma. They are pushing hard. I've lost the junction. Deck 2, dorsal airlock, they're through, the bridge security officer reported. And now Tessia could hear the cutting tools through the deck above them, a high-pitched whine that vibrated in her teeth. She looked at her console. The compact of Vethon's signal had been in flight for 11 minutes. No response, no acknowledgement. The interspecies band was silent. She checked the signal's propagation estimate. It had reached approximately 14 light minutes in all directions, an expanding sphere of distress that was either being heard by someone or evaporating into the void. There was no way to know which. The hegemony's own monitoring of the compact frequency was nominal at best, a passive listener embedded in the communication software that flagged incoming signals, but that no one in Tessia's 6 years of service had ever seen activate. If the hegemony's commitment to monitoring the frequency it was bound to was this perfunctory, what reason was there to believe any other signatory did better? Devrin's voice crackled through the comm. Deck 4, we're at frame 35. Lost Corporal Yennick's shoulder wound. He's conscious but out of the fight. They've taken the junction and the forward storage compartments. They're not stopping. The cutting noise above the bridge stopped. A moment of silence. Then an explosion, a shaped breaching charge that blew the dorsal hatch inward and showered the bridge with debris. Tessia threw herself sideways. A chunk of composite material struck her shoulder and spun her into the deck. She tasted blood again. She got up again. Seraphine boarders dropped through the breach, 4 of them, armored in dark composite plate, weapons leveled. They were tall, angular, their faces hidden behind polarized visors. They moved like mechanics performing a practiced operation, sweeping the bridge with weapons while one of them barked orders in their own language. The bridge security officer fired once and hit the lead boarder in the chest. The boarder staggered but did not fall. The armor absorbed the shot. The return fire hit the security officer in the leg and dropped him. A second shot hit the console bank to Tessia's left, and glass from the shattered display scattered across the deck in fragments that caught the emergency lighting. Sarth stood. He stood from the command chair with his burned arm hanging and his sidearm in his good hand, and he said, in a voice that carried the weight of 38 years of service, "This is Fleet Commander Sarth Venalar. You are aboard a hegemony military vessel. You will remove yourselves." The Seraphine team leader raised a weapon toward him. One of the boarders stepped forward and struck Sarth across the face with the stock of a rifle, and the commander went down. He did not get up. Tessia was on the floor behind the secondary communications console. Her sidearm was in her hand, but she had not fired it. She was looking at Sarth, who was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and whose burned arm was twisted under him at an angle that made her stomach clench. She was looking at the bridge crew, who were being forced to their knees by the boarding party, the helmsman, the sensor operator, the junior tactical officer who had been breathing too fast since the attack began, and who was now completely still, the way people become still when the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. She was looking at her console, which was still active, still connected to the interspecies band, still broadcasting the compact of Vethon distress signal into the silence. No one had answered. She felt the thing that had no name settle into her chest like a coal. It was not fear. Fear would have been easier. Fear would have told her to stay down, stay silent, wait for the boarding party to take her with the others. What she felt was something harder, a fury that burned not for herself, but for the 214 people on the ship who were being taken, for the 6 engineers barricaded in auxiliary control listening to a cutting tool eat through their hatch, for the security teams that had fought and bled and fallen back, for Commander Sarth bleeding on his own bridge, for Ensign Trevis down on Deck 4 with blunt force trauma to the torso and no medic coming. Furious compassion, that was the only name she could find for it. The Seraphine team leader was speaking into a communications device. Tessia did not understand the language, but the tone was operational. Status report. The ship is taken. The crew is being collected. Send the holding vessels. Her console chirped. The sound was small, a single tone from the interspecies frequency band, the kind of acknowledgement pulse that communication systems sent when a signal was received and logged. It was the sound of someone hearing the compact of Vethon distress call and confirming receipt. Tessia looked at her console. The acknowledgement code resolved on her display. It was not hegemony. It was not Rishkari, not coalition, not Vendarathi. It was a code she had never seen in operational traffic, but she had seen it once before, in the signatory's annex of the compact of Vethon itself. Terran Cooperative Service, Compact Response Authority, Article 91. The acknowledgement was followed, 4 seconds later, by a second signal. A short burst transmission, tightly formatted on the same interspecies band. Tessia's console decoded it automatically. Terran Cooperative Service Compact of VTHAN, Article 91 Response. Receiving Unit, TCS 7th Fleet Patrol Group MARA, Detachment Actual. Distress signal received and authenticated. Hostile boarding action confirmed. Response assets inbound. Arrival 22 minutes. All signatory personnel advised to shelter in place. Commander 7th Fleet, Rear Admiral ELENA VSQEZ. Message ends. Tessia read the message twice. The first time she read the words, the second time she read the implications. 7th Fleet, not a patrol ship, not a corvette that happened to be in the area, a fleet. A Terran fleet with a flag officer commanding had received the compact of Vethon distress signal and was responding with what the message described as response assets, a term that, in military communications, was deliberately vague enough to cover anything from a single shuttle to an armada. And it was 22 minutes out. 22 minutes was specific, not approximately or estimated. 22 minutes, as if the fleet had calculated the exact transit time from its current position to the Pale Resolve and reported it to the minute because that was the kind of information the receiving party needed. The Seraphine team leader had not seen the message. The console was small, the display was dim, and the team leader was occupied with securing the bridge crew. But Tessia had read it, and the coal in her chest changed temperature. It was still fury, but now it had a horizon. 22 minutes. She looked at Sarth, who was still on the deck bleeding, his burned arm folded under him. She looked at the bridge crew on their knees. She looked at the internal sensor grid, where she could see the Seraphine boarding parties moving through the ship, collecting crew members, herding them toward the cargo bays. She keyed the console. She did not transmit on the interspecies band. She transmitted on the Pale Resolve's internal communication system, the all-hands channel that every crew member's personal communicator received. All hands, this is Communications Officer Von Raschel. Hold your positions. Help is inbound. 22 minutes. The Seraphine team leader turned toward her. The polarized visor made the face unreadable, but the body language was clear. The team leader crossed the bridge in 3 strides, grabbed the edge of the console, and ripped the communications unit from its mount. Sparks scattered across the deck. The console went dark. The team leader said something in the Seraphine language. Tessia did not need a translator. The meaning was clear: be silent, or we will make you silent. She was silent, but she had sent the message. Every communicator on the ship had received it. Every crew member who was still conscious, still breathing, still holding a corridor or a barricade or a sealed compartment door, knew that something was coming. The Seraphine did not know what they had heard. They did not know the frequency. They did not know the compact. They did not know that a 43-year-old treaty signed in a language that no longer existed had just been auto-invoked by a communications officer sitting on the floor of a ruined bridge, and that the treaty's activation clause did not care whether the hegemony had intended to call Earth, because the treaty did not specify intent. It specified condition. And the condition, hostile boarding action against signatory personnel, had been met. The next 18 minutes were the longest of Tessia's life. The Seraphine completed their sweep of the ship with the efficiency of professionals who had done this work many times. They gathered the crew in the main cargo bay, 197 people, including 31 wounded. 17 crew members were unaccounted for, either dead in the initial attack or sealed in compartments the Seraphine had not yet breached. Commander Sorath was brought in with his hands bound, his burned arm hanging, the cut above his eye crusted with blood. He walked. He walked because he was hegemony military, and hegemony military walked. Tessia was brought in with the bridge crew. She had not resisted. She had calculated that resistance at this stage would result in injury or death without tactical benefit, and she needed to be alive in 22 minutes, now 14 minutes, because she was the only person on the ship who knew what was coming, and she needed to be alive to see it arrive. The cargo bay was cold. The environmental systems on this deck were damaged, and the air tasted of burned insulation and ozone. The crew sat on the deck in rows, guarded by Seraphine soldiers who walked the perimeter with the relaxed posture of people who believed the operation was over. The 3 Seraphine ships were visible through the cargo bays loading port dark-hulled vessels, angular, functional, holding position around the pale resolve like wolves that had run down their quarry and were settling in to feed. Tessia counted the guards, 8 in the cargo bay. She could hear others in the corridors, perhaps another 12 throughout the ship, holding key positions, securing engineering, preparing the pale resolve for tow. One of them was dragging a portable power coupler toward the port docking clamp, the first step in attaching a tow cable. Another was interfacing with the pale resolve's navigation computer, pulling coordinate data for the transit route back to Seraphine territory. They worked with the methodical efficiency of a well-drilled crew. These were not amateurs. These were people who had taken ships before, who had procedures and checklists, and who followed them the way Tessia followed communications protocols, because the procedure was what kept you alive. The boarding parties were consolidating. They believed the ship was theirs. She looked at the loading port. Space beyond it was black and silent. The 3rd Boundary Patrol's nearest unit was still hours away. The hegemony's rescue would arrive to find an empty ship if it arrived at all. That was the calculation the Seraphine had made: hit, board, take, leave before help comes. It was a calculation that had worked for them for 3 centuries. The calculation did not include the compact of Vethon. 12 minutes. One of the wounded crew members, a young sensor technician named Paliv, who had taken a fragment in the side and was breathing in short, wet gasps, looked at Tessia from across the row. He had heard the all-hands transmission. His eyes asked the question his voice could not. Tessia nodded once. 10 minutes. The Seraphine team leader entered the cargo bay. Behind the leader came 2 more soldiers, and between them, supported by his good arm, was Chief Engineer Pollux. The Seraphine had breached auxiliary control. Pollux's face was bruised, and one of his hands was bleeding, but he was walking. He was placed with the other officers, and the team leader surveyed the cargo bay with the satisfaction of a completed task. 8 minutes. The team leader spoke to a subordinate. Tessia could not understand the words, but she could read the body language and the operational rhythm. The subordinate left the cargo bay and returned 2 minutes later with a report. The pale resolve was secure. All compartments cleared. All crew accounted for or dead. The tow coupling could be attached within 30 minutes. They would have the ship in the Seraphine corridor before the hegemony even knew it was missing. 6 minutes. Tessia felt her heartbeat in her throat. She was watching the loading port. She was watching for something she had never seen with her own eyes, a Terran warship. She had only seen them in the intelligence databases, flat images and technical specifications that described vessels in the way a biologist might describe a predator by its teeth and claws, without conveying what it felt like to see one move. 4 minutes. Nothing. The stars beyond the loading port were steady. The Seraphine ships held position. The guards walked their patrol. The wounded groaned and bled. Ensign Treves, who had been carried in on an improvised stretcher, was unconscious, her breathing visible only as the faint movement of her chest. The medic kneeling beside her had no equipment left except pressure bandages, and was applying them with the careful economy of someone who knew that the next wounded person would need what was left. Corporal Yannick, whose shoulder wound had been packed with emergency gauze in the corridor, sat with his back against a cargo container and his good arm wrapped around a younger crewman who was shaking. Devrin was on his feet, his weapon confiscated, his jaw set, his eyes tracking the guard pattern with the systematic focus of a man who was not planning to do anything not yet, but who wanted the information in case the situation changed. Tessia recognized the look. It was the same look she had been wearing since she sent the compact signal, the look of someone holding a variable that nobody else in the room knew existed. Tessia's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and counted her breathing. She had sent the signal. The acknowledgement had come back. 22 minutes. The math was clear, but math was not certainty, and the gap between them was where hope went to die. 2 minutes. One of the Seraphine soldiers at the perimeter stopped walking. He tilted his head, listening to something in his helmet communicator. Then he turned to the team leader and said something sharp and fast. The team leader responded with a single word that Tessia did not need to translate. The word was an order. The word meant weapons up. Tessia looked at the loading port. The first ship came out of subspace at the edge of the pale Resolve's visual range, a shape against the stars that resolved into something solid and angular and very, very large. It was not one ship. As the subspace distortion cleared, the shape separated into multiple contacts, each one burning with the particular engine signature that Tessia's trained eye recognized from the intelligence files she had studied, because she studied everything. Terran, the hulls were Terran, and there were many. The Seraphine sensor alarms began screaming. The sound was audible even inside the cargo bay, a piercing wail from the nearest raider vessel that penetrated the hull and filled the space with the sound of a predator, discovering it was no longer at the top of the food chain. Through the loading port, the Terran fleet resolved into individual contacts. Tessia counted because counting was what she did under stress. 1, 2, 3 heavy cruisers, their silhouettes broad and angular against the boundary star's light, running with full navigation arrays active. 4, 5 destroyers flanking them in a screen pattern, each one already oriented with weapons arcs covering the Seraphine vessels. 6, 7, 8 escort frigates forming a cordon that enclosed the entire engagement zone, a perimeter around the pale Resolve and her captors that closed like a fist. 9 a ship that was larger than the others, running with more lights, broadcasting more actively, positioned at the center of the formation like the heart of an organism. A flagship, the kind of vessel that a rear admiral commanded. 9 warships, for a boarding action involving 3 raider vessels and a single disabled cruiser. The Seraphine team leader was speaking rapidly into a communicator. The tone had changed. The operational confidence was gone, replaced by something clipped and urgent. The guards in the cargo bay had stopped walking their patrol and were gathered near the loading port, looking out at the arriving fleet with the posture of people who were performing a calculation and not liking the result. One of the guards lowered his weapon entirely and stood with it hanging at his side, as if holding it up had suddenly become a gesture too absurd to maintain. one of the Terran destroyers moved. It separated from the formation and closed on the nearest Seraphine vessel at a speed that Tessia found difficult to reconcile with its size. The destroyer was smaller than the Seraphine raider, but it moved with the precision of something that had been designed for exactly this kind of approach, not aggressive, not threatening in the explicit sense, purposeful. A vessel positioning itself between the raider and the disabled Pale resolve with the calm efficiency of a professional performing a routine operation. A second destroyer mirrored the maneuver on the opposite side, and now 2 of the 3 Seraphine ships were flanked. The Terran flagship was broadcasting. Tessia could not hear the transmission, her console had been destroyed, but she could see the Seraphine team leader's reaction to whatever was being said. The team leader went still. The communicator lowered an inch. The posture changed from operational command to something Tessia had not expected to see from a Seraphine raider: uncertainty. Then the flagship broadcast on a frequency that the Pale Resolve's internal speakers could receive, the interspecies common hailing frequency. Open, unencrypted, intended to be heard by everyone. Seraphine vessels, this is Rear Admiral Elena Vasquez, Terran Cooperative Service, 7th Fleet. You have boarded a vessel belonging to a signatory of the Compact of Vethon. Article 91 has been invoked. You will release all personnel, withdraw from the boarded vessel, and stand down your weapons within 10 minutes. Compliance is not optional. Failure to comply will be met with the full response authority granted under Article 91, Section 12, which authorizes the use of force to recover signatory personnel and neutralize hostile actors. The clock starts now. The voice was flat, not angry, not threatening. The way a person reads an instruction manual aloud. The words carried no emotion because the emotion was not in the words, the emotion was in the 9 warships holding formation around 3 raider vessels, and the fact that the speaker had not asked for negotiation, had not opened with a greeting, had not offered terms. She had stated a condition, specified a timeline, and described the consequence. As if the outcome were already decided, and the only variable was whether the Seraphine would make it easy or hard. Tessia looked at Devrin. Devrin looked at Tessia. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. The variable that nobody else knew about had just announced itself on the interspecies common hailing frequency, and the announcement had come with 9 hulls and a 10-minute deadline. The cargo bay was silent. 200 crew members stared at the loading port where the Terran fleet hung in formation against the stars, running lights burning steady, hulls catching the distant light of the boundary's nearest star. The warships were weathered, not clean, not gleaming, not parade ground vessels. They had the look of ships that had been used, maintained, repaired, used again. Scratches in the hull plating. Scorch marks near the engine housings. Mismatched panels where battle damage had been patched with whatever was available. These were working ships. Ships that had been somewhere before they came here and would go somewhere after. The Seraphine team leader stood in the center of the cargo bay, communicator in hand, surrounded by 8 soldiers who were looking at their leader and waiting for an order that did not come for 47 seconds. 47 seconds is a long time when 9 warships are counting to 10 minutes. The team leader gave the order. The soldiers lowered their weapons. The bindings were cut from the crew members' hands. The Seraphine boarders withdrew through the corridors of the Pale Resolve in reverse order, moving quickly, not running but not walking either, clearing compartments, pulling back through the hull breaches they had entered, returning to their own vessels with the focused haste of people who had done the math and decided that the math did not favor them. Tessia watched them go. She watched from the cargo bay floor where she had been sitting with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, counting her heartbeats, and she felt the cold in her chest change again. It was not fury anymore. It was something quieter and harder to name, a feeling like standing in a doorway that she had opened without knowing what was on the other side, and finding that the other side was someone standing there, already waiting, already equipped, already in motion, because a piece of paper signed 43 years ago had said they would be. The Seraphine ships withdrew. They pulled back from the Pale Resolve, powered up their drives, and translated into subspace without firing a shot. Not one of the 9 Terran warships fired either. Not one adjusted its weapons posture from the ready state it had maintained since arrival. They did not pursue. They did not need to. The Seraphine had boarded ships for 3 centuries, and in 3 centuries they had never encountered a response on a frequency they did not know existed, from a species they had not planned for, arriving with a fleet that outmassed their operation by a factor they clearly had not considered worth calculating. The 9 Terran warships held formation around the Pale Resolve with the patient stillness of sentinels who had arrived at their post and intended to stay. 20 minutes after the Seraphine departed, a Terran shuttle detached from the flagship and made its approach to the Pale Resolve's functioning docking port. The shuttle was not a combat craft. It was a medical and engineering transport, the kind of vessel designed to deliver help, not force. It docked with a precision that the Pale Resolve's docking systems, running on backup power, barely managed to accommodate. The first Terrans aboard were medics. 3 of them, carrying equipment in cases marked with symbols Tessia did not recognize but whose function was obvious: medical supplies, field surgical kits, emergency stabilization gear. They moved through the cargo bay with the efficiency of people who had entered wounded ships before and knew where to look for the worst cases first. They found Paliv, the sensor technician with the fragment in his side. One medic knelt beside him, opened a case, and began working with hands that moved fast and sure. A second medic was already moving to the next wounded crew member, Ensign Trevas, whose breathing had grown worryingly shallow in the last 10 minutes. The medic checked her pulse, said something to a colleague, and pulled a piece of equipment from the case that Tessia could not identify but that hummed with a low, steady vibration when activated. Within 2 minutes, Trevas's breathing steadied. The third medic was setting up a portable triage station near the cargo bay wall, organizing supplies with the practiced speed of someone who did not need to think about the order, because the order was trained into her hands. Behind the medics came engineers. A team of 4, carrying toolkits and portable power units, and something that looked like a hull patch assembly of a design Tessia had never seen. They spoke briefly with Chief Engineer Polex, who stared at them with the expression of a man who had been told that help was coming, and had not allowed himself to believe it until it was standing in front of him holding a wrench. The Terran engineering team leader said, "We've got hull patch kits, a portable power unit rated for your grid specifications, and a damage control team standing by on the flagship if you need more hands. What do you want first?" Pollux said, "The port hull breaches. We're venting atmosphere on 3 decks. We'll start there. We brought sealant rated for your hull composite. We cross-referenced your vessel class in the compact registry before departure. Should bond clean." They had looked up the Pale Resolve's hull specifications. Before departure, before they even arrived, they had accessed the compact of Vethon's vessel registry, identified the Pale Resolve's class, determined its hull composite, and brought matching sealant. As if answering a 43-year-old treaty's distress clause were a routine operation that required preparation, and they had prepared. Tessia stood. Her legs were unsteady, but she stood. She made her way through the cargo bay toward the docking port, where the Terran shuttle's ramp was still lowered, and a Terran officer was standing at the base of it, speaking into a communicator with the unhurried cadence of someone reporting to a superior. The officer saw Tessia approach and lowered the communicator. The officer was human, shorter than Tessia, darker-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered by years of service in the way that ships' hulls were weathered by years of patrols. A commander's insignia on the collar, a name tag that read OKONKWO. "Commander Okonkwo," Tessia said. Her voice was hoarse. I am Communications Officer Tessia von Raschel, Hegemony Warship Pale Resolve. I transmitted the compact of Vethon distress signal. The commander looked at her. The expression was not triumphant. It was not pitying. It was the expression of a professional acknowledging another professional, a flat, competent recognition that the job had been done on both sides. You invoked Article 91, Okonkwo said. Yes. Hostile boarding action against signatory personnel. Yes. How many wounded? 31 at last count. One critical sensor technician, fragment wound side. Your medic is with him now. Another ensign Treves, blunt force trauma torso. Your second medic has stabilized her. Good. The Admiral has dispatched a second medical team from the cruiser Halcyon. They'll be alongside in 8 minutes. We're also bringing over a portable surgical suite. Your infirmary took damage. Yes, the forward section was hit in the initial attack. Our chief medical officer has been operating with field kits since the boarding began. Okonkwo nodded once, as if this were expected, as if damage to the infirmary were a variable that had been anticipated and planned for before the shuttle launched. We'll set up the surgical suite in your secondary medical bay. My engineers will prioritize your hull breaches, then your environmental systems, then your main drive. Estimated time to restore atmospheric integrity, 90 minutes. Drive restoration. We'll need to assess with your chief engineer, but we brought coupling relays and power distribution nodes. You brought coupling relays. Standard loadout for a compact response. Your vessel class uses Mark 7 relay junctions. We carry 5s, 7s, and 9s. They carried the parts. 3 different models covering the range of systems they might encounter, because the compact of Vethon had signatories with different technologies, and the Terran 7th Fleet had stocked its response kits to fit all of them. 43 years of stocking those kits. 43 years of carrying parts for ships they might never be called to repair, for treaties they might never be asked to honor, for species who did not know the frequency was still monitored. Tessia felt the thing in her chest break open. Not the fury had spent itself when the Seraphine withdrew. What broke open was the thing beneath the fury, the thing she had been holding in place with professional distance and counted breaths, and the discipline of a communications officer who read everything and prepared for everything, and still had not been prepared for this. We did not call you, she said. Okonkwo looked at her. The distress signal was broadcast on the compact frequency. It was not addressed to the Terran Cooperative Service. It was not addressed to anyone. It was auto-invoked. The treaty required it. I transmitted it because the conditions were met and the protocol demanded it. I did not specifically request Terran assistance. Okonkwo's expression did not change. No. Then why are you here? Because the compact of Vethon says we respond. Article 91, hostile boarding action against signatory personnel. We received the signal. We authenticated the signal. We responded with available assets. A pause. Available assets happen to be 7th Fleet. 9 warships. That's what was available. For 3 raiders. The article doesn't specify proportionality. It specifies response. Tessia stared at the commander. Behind Okonkwo, through the docking port, she could see the Terran flagship through the viewport, a vast shape against the stars, running lights steady, hull scarred with the history of a ship that had done this before and would do it again. Through the docking port's side viewport, a second Terran shuttle was making its approach the Halcyon's medical team, arriving on schedule, 8 minutes after the first. The compact of Vethon, Tessia said, was signed 43 years ago, in a language that no longer exists, on a station that has been decommissioned, by representatives of governments that have, in several cases, been replaced by successor states. Your government has honored it for 43 years. 44 in September, Okonkwo said. Why? Because we signed it. The answer was so flat, so devoid of emphasis, that it took Tessia a moment to understand that it was not evasion. It was the entire answer. They signed it. They honor it. The document is the reason. The pen that was loaned was the beginning. The fleet that arrived was the continuation. The compact was not a piece of paper gathering dust in an archive. It was a standing order that had been standing for 43 years, and the Terran 7th Fleet had responded to it the way a muscle responds to a nerve signal automatically, without deliberation, because that was what the system was designed to do. She turned and looked at the cargo bay behind her. The Terran medics were still working. Paliv was being stabilized. She could see the color returning to his face as the Terran medical equipment did whatever it did. The engineering team was already gone, headed for the port hull breaches with their sealant and their portable power units and their cross-referenced hull specifications. The hegemony crew members were standing now, some helping the wounded, some simply standing and looking at the Terran personnel moving through their ship with the quiet, focused competence of people who had rehearsed this scenario and were performing it now in reality. The second shuttle docked, and 3 more medics came aboard, carrying a portable surgical suite in sections that they assembled in the secondary medical bay with the speed of people who had practiced the setup, until they could do it with their eyes closed. Commander Sareth was sitting against the cargo bay wall. A Terran medic was examining his burned arm with the careful hands of someone who had treated burns before and who was making a point of being gentle about it. Sareth's face was unreadable, but his eyes followed the medic's work with the expression of a man watching something he had not expected and did not fully understand. Tessia walked back to Sareth and knelt beside him. "Commander." "I heard the broadcast," Sareth said. His voice was quiet. The cut above his eye had been closed with a medical adhesive Terran applied by the medic. Article 91. "Yes, Commander." "I was not aware the compact was still active." "Neither was I until today." He was silent for a moment. The medic working on his arm applied something from a tube, a salve, or a regenerative compound, and Sareth winced once, the first sign of pain Tessia had seen from him through the entire ordeal. "I told you to know the legal architecture," he said. "You did." "I did not expect it to answer." Tessia looked at the loading port. The Terran fleet held formation around the Pale Resolve 9 warships, steady, lights burning, hulls weathered by decades of patrols and responses, and standing orders honored. The second medical team from the cruiser Halcyon was already at work in the surgical suite, and through the internal comm Tessia could hear the Terran engineers calling instructions to each other in the port corridors, the sound of sealant applicators and power coupler diagnostics, and the steady, purposeful noise of a ship being put back together by people who had brought the right parts. The Compact of Vethon had been signed in a language that no longer existed, by representatives who no longer served, on a station that no longer existed. Earth had signed it with its own pen and loaned a spare to a stranger. And 43 years later, when a communications officer on a burning ship had invoked its provisions because the protocol demanded it, 9 Terran warships had arrived in 22 minutes with medics, engineers, coupling relays in 3 different specifications. Hull patch sealant cross-referenced to the vessel class, a portable surgical suite, and a rear admiral who stated her terms as if the outcome had already been decided. Over the next 48 hours, the Terran 7th Fleet remained on station. They patched the hull breaches. They restored atmospheric integrity in 93 minutes, 3 minutes over estimate, for which the Terran engineering team leader apologized to Pollux as if 3 minutes were a professional failing. They repaired the main drive using the Mark 7 coupling relays they had carried. They rebuilt the forward sensor array with components scavenged from their own supply stores and fabricated to Ketharin-class specifications aboard the flagship's machine shop. They treated all 31 wounded, including Ensign Trevas, who regained consciousness on the second day, and asked the Terran medic hovering over her what had happened. The medic told her. Trevis's response was to ask whether the compact of Vethon had a provision for sending a thank you note. The medic did not know, neither did Tessia. The Terran fleet departed on the morning of the third day, having restored the Pale Resolve to operational status. Rear Admiral Vasquez did not come aboard. She did not request a meeting with Commander Sarath. She did not send a formal communication beyond the operational updates exchanged between the engineering and medical teams. The fleet withdrew the same way it had arrived, precisely, methodically, without ceremony. Tessia filed the after-action report that afternoon from the Pale Resolve's restored communication station, on equipment the Terran engineers had repaired using parts they had brought because they had looked up the specifications before they came. The report went a boundary command at Station Karev 4, which received it with the particular silence of an institution discovering that a treaty it had forgotten was the reason 214 of its people were still alive. In the report's final line, Tessia wrote the only thing she had left to write. The distress signal was transmitted on the compact of Vethon frequency, Article 91 auto-invoke. It was not addressed to the Terran Cooperative Service. The Terran Cooperative Service responded. 9 warships, 22 minutes. They brought medical teams, engineering teams, hull patch sealant matched to our vessel class, coupling relays in 3 specifications, a portable surgical suite, and a rear admiral who did not negotiate. They stayed for 48 hours. They did not request compensation, recognition, or reciprocity. When I asked Commander Okonkwo why they had come, the commander said, "Because we signed it. I have no additional observations." Von Raschel, Communications Officer, Pale Resolve. The compact of Vethon is still active. Earth still monitors the frequency. The pen is still loaned. Boundary Command has not issued a response to the report. But Tessia has noted that the Hegemony's interspecies protocol submenu, which was previously labeled in text so small it was nearly illegible, has been enlarged in the latest software update to full-size font. And the compact of Vethon's entry has been moved from the bottom of the list to the top.